Good evening. It's great to see all of you out there, if not in person, for our audiences in the US and for those night owls in Rome. Welcome. I'm Mark Robbins, President of the American Academy in Rome, which, as many of you know, is an institution that annually provides scholars and artists with a place to live and work together in Rome. And the work that they produce on their return has an impact for generations. It's great to have so many of you with us tonight for this second public program of the 2020 season. We'd like to thank the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation for its continued support of these programs and the AAR staff here and in Rome, Elizabeth Rodini, who's with us tonight, High School Arts Director, Lynn Lancaster, the Mellon Professor, and Mark McClary, our Director of Communications. We're so very pleased to have artist Kathy Opie with us tonight, and we are doubly pleased to be welcoming Kathy to the Academy as a resident. She will be the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation Resident in Photography in the new year when the Academy opens again to receive this year's fellowship community. And this year, the theme at the Academy is the city. And the city, which we know from Jefferson's famous quote about it being pestilential, having seen firsthand the dense crowding and poverty in Paris and London in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of suspicion of the unsavory nature of cities persists in the US. It's associated with foreignness, with difference, but cities provide refuge, a place of personal reinvention and creativity. And this idea of personal freedom is also embodied in another place of American mythology, the frontier, with endless possibilities, the pioneer on the road, the renegade, the rugged individual freed from limits. In between these poles, American landscapes stretch out across the gridded nation and in the vertical grids of its cities. This is the expansive terrain of tonight's speaker, Kathy Opie, whose work presents an America of possibilities in the expressions of faces and bodies, communities seen in public and private, in domestic rituals, and street demonstrations that show political will. These images are serenely beautiful, lush, tender, formally composed, and erotically charged, resonant with the history of making images. Her work defies the need to make easy categories, encouraging each viewer to stop and reconsider what is familiar and unfamiliar around us. Born in Sandusky, Ohio, we're told that Kathy Opie, as a child, was given a Kodak Instamatic, taking photographs in her community and creating her own darkroom at 14. By this point, the family had moved to San Diego. Kathy completed a master's in fine arts at Cal Arts in 1988, and her thesis master plan looked at construction sites and suburban interiors. From there, she gained renown as a maker of portraits in her 1988 series, Being and Having, and continued to make landscapes of mini malls, more portraits, and looking at the social constructions that are embedded in identity and community. Opie is a professor of photography at UCLA, where she has taught since 2001. Her solo exhibitions include, and this is just a few, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, her survey at the Guggenheim Museum in 2008-09, the Wexner Center back in Ohio, and MoCA in Los Angeles. Opie has participated in many, many group shows, and we're pleased that one of these group exhibitions was the American Embody. Oh, the academic body, which was shown at the American Academy in Rome, which looked at ideas about beauty and the figure while presenting the trajectory of artistic disciplines at the American Academy over its 125-year history. Kathy Opie is a recipient of many awards, including a United States Artist Fellowship, a Women's Caucus for the Art President's Award, the Archives of American Art Medal, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Just a word before we start about the format of this evening. Kathy will give an overview of her work, which we're all looking forward to, with a conversation between us to follow. And then we will open up the virtual floor for questions. And for the Q&A, given the number of people online, please use your text feature to send in questions, and we will receive those and ask them for the whole group so that we can respond. And with that, it is a great, great pleasure to bring Kathy Opie to the screen tonight. Kathy.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I especially want to thank the American Academy in Rome for being patient with me. You know, I got an original ask in 2016, and I have to, this might seem surprising to many people. I've been to Italy many times, but I have actually never been to Rome. So the idea of being able to go and leave this country, which, as everybody knows, America is having a pretty hard time right now. I'm really looking forward to this. And I especially want to thank the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, which I've had a long history with, and continuing to support me as an artist as well as my practice, and giving this support to such an incredibly historically important place as the American Academy. This is going to be a really rough, not rough, but a very odd selection of an overview. Because it's not an artist talk that I give like an hour talk about my work, I decided to basically allow you to traverse with me through different histories to try to begin to really lay out my practice in relationship to both portraiture and landscape, and ideas around community that have always formed all my various bodies of work. So I'm going to just start with the first image and kind of dig in a little bit within my history. So as Mark said, I kind of started photographing when I was 9 years old, and I ended up getting a camera for my 9th birthday. I had written a report on the photographer Lewis Hine, who actually changed the child labor laws in this country through the imagery of children working in factories. And it was the first time ever that policy was made through photography. And I went on and I just continued it and was completely in love with it. Built a darkroom out of babysitting money when I was 14, and went to San Francisco Art Institute to receive my bachelor's degree, which I graduated from in 1985. And then Cal Arts in 1988. And then I've been teaching for the last 30 years in various institutions, with the last 20 being at UCLA. I really have always thought of photography as the great communicator in relationship to our histories. And I think that starts out really from Lewis Hine. And this is a photograph that I made in 1993, and it's of my friend Joe. And after I left Cal Arts in 88, I went back out and I started making work that I had kind of made in Cal Arts around Los Angeles, especially around an area in LA called MacArthur Park, in which gentrification was happening. And it was a park that was like really had a lot of problems in relationship to drug and homeless issues. And this was also right in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. And I wanted to switch my practice to be a more studio-based practice to really talk about the architecture of the queer body. And so using the bright colored backgrounds and photographing my friends in this way that it was very regal. I kind of, you know, Hans Holbein was my my go-to for this, and thinking about the history of portraiture. And I wanted to create an idea around visibility within my own community and the fragility in that moment in time in which I had lost so many friends from AIDS. And so I made this body of work. I started in 1991 and I went through 95. I have two images from this. This is Joe, and the next one is Robert Blanchon. And this is an artist, a really important artist of my generation who died of AIDS. And you know, his body was starting to slowly, his genes hanging down, all of that, but still utterly being beautiful and sexy in himself. And it was important for me to use kind of ideas of seduction and color and the body, and for our gaze to be placed on the body. So in some ways, like being supported by Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation for this residency, it was definitely a conversation that I was having with Mapplethorpe to a certain extent in relationship to the bodies of work I did around my queer community. And especially being that most of my friends were involved in the SM leather community that I was making images of. And so I ended up having like a really going from no gallery representation, not really showing in museums, showing in small little alternative spaces that were collectives in the queer community, to then being embraced by Regan Projects representing me, and Jay Gorney Modern Art in New York. And I was put in the 1995 Whitney Biennial, and things were starting to happen for me as an artist at a time in which I thought that I was going to be shut down as an artist. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get an academic job now for coming out in this way. And there was still a lot of fear around that. And I appreciated all of that attention, but there was all this other work that I had made throughout my time as an artist that I didn't know how to necessarily bring those things together, because I was being considered like, oh, you know, Catherine Opie's the leather dyke photographer of our generation. And even though I was very proud to hold that title, there were always things that I was interested in. So in 94 and 95, I started this body of work, which is the Freeways. And so the Freeways were panoramically shot. They're shot with a panorama camera that Fuji made. The negatives are 6 centimeters by 17 centimeters. And then all of these prints were platinum prints. And I wanted to, my work always, in the same way that the portraits look at Holbein, my work always is in conversation or dialogue with the history of art. And so by doing platinum prints of these emptied out freeways, you'll notice that there are no cars except for maybe in the very far distance. Go back to the freeways. Thanks, Heather. The emptying out to me was also looking at the structure in the same way the structure of identity is held within the bodies of my friends. The structure of identity and the specificity of identity is also held in places. And I've really traversed that throughout all my various bodies of work. And then after I did the Freeways, which is 40 images in the series, I got a bigger panorama camera, which is actually it's a 8 by 17, so 8 inch by 17 inches, which go to the American cities now, if you don't mind. So this is Wall Street. This is one of the last American city. Actually, Chicago was the last American city that in the body of work, but American cities started in Los Angeles with me thinking about the specificity of identity in relationship to place and how it's built. And it kind of is wrapped up a little bit in terms of the American history around capitalism too. So in I photographed Chicago, St. Louis, Wall Street, LA, I'm missing a city. Sorry about that. It'll come to me in a moment. But this is Wall Street. This was taken in 2001, and it was actually right before 9/11, and I had no idea, as many of us did, that 9/11 would happen. And that is one of the things that happens with ideas around making work for me photographically, is time changes so quickly. And what is it to bear witness? What is it to make a conversation about the places that we live in? How do we think about the structure in relationship to the structures of our society? So between portraiture and kind of the landscape, those are the things that I dig into. So the next image from this body of work is also of Wall Street. Very iconic image of where George Washington was inaugurated from. You have the church in the background, and then one of the things that happened within this body of work is it became very ghostly to a certain extent after 9/11, because in all these images, so many of them ended up having the towers in the distance. And the other aspect of me thinking about specifically photographing Wall Street panoramically is it's a Western kind of gaze, right? So me being from California and on the West, you have the great panorama of the West versus thinking about the verticality of New York and how it was really looked at for so many years, and specifically from somebody like Bernice Abbott as an image maker. So go to the next. So then going back to portraits, this one was done in 2009. So we're jumping ahead of many bodies of work, but we're going to jump back and forth a little bit just to go over it. And this is my friend Pigpen, who I've photographed for years, who is in multiple bodies of work, being in Having, the early portraits. I made a whole body of work 4 years ago called The Modernist, which is a film where Pigpen plays this artist character. And so Pigpen is somebody who is really important to me in my life. My friends, I continually make images of them. And this was part of a body of work called Girlfriends. And so let's go to the next. Then in 2012, like thinking about place and portraiture, this is one of the images that I will show you of 2 images from the body of work 700 Neames Road. It just so happened that Elizabeth Taylor and I shared the same accountant. And my accountant for years would say, yeah, do you want to do anything with Elizabeth Taylor? And I would be like, I don't know. I don't know what to do with Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, she's one of the most important movie stars. She's utterly iconic. Every single famous photographer has photographed her. So I don't know what I would want to do. And I was at the time thinking about the body of work I had made, Inauguration, which was a little bit in conversation with Eggleston's body of work called Election Eve, where he went around Plains, Georgia, and photographed before Carter became president. And then I was also thinking about Eggleston's photographs of Graceland. And I kind of went back to my accountant and Elizabeth Taylor's herself and her household manager, and said that I wanted to make a portrait of her through her home. And it was a 6-month body of work. This is out of Elizabeth's closet. There's a whole series of closets. I made a book on it called 700 Neames, as well as a portfolio. And then the next image you have is her bedside table. And so I wanted a different kind of humanist, like, you know, to come out of this. And humanity is utterly important in everything I do as an artist, and thinking about how people and places are portrayed. And so, you know, you have what makes this image for me is that you have her bedside table is so informs us about her life. But the most important thing in my mind is the dog-eared remote control manual, because none of us know how to use our remote controls, and that makes it like very touched to me. It's like somebody's touched that. It's a very human moment. And So that began to merge a little bit of the ideas of what I want to actually try to accomplish in Rome, and which that a place can be a portrait. And I've looked at that obviously with American cities and even freeways and other bodies of work, but I'm really interested in trying to merge that in a more complicated way. And so then we're going to go to an image from back in time to 1998. And this is of Christopher and Clara. And this is more what Mark was talking about in terms of road trips and what it means to kind of go out and seek and find and think about, you know, kind of creating a body of work from a road trip. So I bought an RV and I spent 3.5 months finding lesbians throughout America to allow me to do domestic photographs of them. And this is like the first time where I'm taking the portraits of people outside the studio, and I'm not emptying out cities. So I'm kind of putting people back in the place and in their environments. And this is also in conversation with Tina Barney's work, with Gregory Crutzen's work, with a whole host of histories of photography in relationship to editorial photography. But domestic was really important as we began to think about the rights that we were fighting for in relationship to the ability to marry, what that means, how do we make family. And these were shot specifically with an 8x10 camera for those of you who are actually interested in that kind of technical stuff, which I am, but some people are like, okay. But so, and then on another road trip prior to the, after this piece came 1999. So I'm really interested in framing things with what is happening around us. So 1999 had what I call the quaint fear. We have so many more bigger fears now, but it was the quaint fear of Y2K. We thought that we were going to lose all of our information. We thought, oh my God, it's going to hit midnight and we're not going to have a bank account anymore. Like everything's going to go away. It's all going to disappear. So I made a body of work where I traveled from New York to California. I was living in New York at the time. I was teaching at Yale, and decided to do the Great American Road Trip, like thinking about the history of Walker Evans, about what the American road trip meant in photography. So this is one of the images from that body of work, 1999. So we're going to jump back into the future now with what is currently, I think it's just coming down actually at Lehman Maupin Gallery, and it also showed at Regan Projects right before the pandemic shut down everything here in Los Angeles. But I went to the ACA, which is Atlantic Center of the Arts in Florida, to teach. And I started working on a body of work called Rhetorical Landscapes. So we have heard over and over for now 6 or 7 years in this country with President Trump talking about draining the swamps. So rhetoric, the rhetoric of the swamp as this place. And I decided while I was in Florida that I would go and seek out swamps and photograph swamps and think about swamps as an actual place that is not only really important, but will also disappear because of global warming and the rising of the seas. And I wanted to kind of begin to try to talk about that, what that was. And then I paired this, which I don't have an image of, but I used these large monitors that look like oversized iPhones. And you guys can go to either Regan Projects or Lehman Maupin and click on and be able to see the work. But the monitors are stop motion animated political collages that you see get created around the different issues of today. So you have the pause of the beautiful swamp landscape and then the cacophony of the media coming at us every day with all of these issues beginning to happen. Let's go to the next. So high school football was also an extension of American landscape for me. It was at a time I started the body of work in 2008, 2007, around there. And everywhere you go in this country is a high school football field. And so going from Alaska to Hawaii to all the way across the country, photographing this as a landscape and then with it with portraits. And I was thinking a lot about the vulnerability of these young boys. They're trained to be soldiers. A lot of them were going off to war in Afghanistan and Iraq if they didn't get football scholarships, and just the fragility. And also that's something, you know, I remember being like really scared of the football players in high school because I was definitely, you know, not out yet, but I definitely didn't look like a pretty girl in California, let's just say. And so to make these next slides, these very tender portraits of these young men in their lives. So we're working on the somebody asked about football in Manhattan high schools. I actually went out to Staten Island. So I did photograph in Staten Island high school football. This is David, Austin, and Bryant from Ohio. And they were the only African-American kids on this team at an all-Jewish private high school in Ohio. And they really wanted to be photographed together. And we have, the next one is Dominique from Texas. And so you can see like I'm using lighting in a certain way here that is like, you know, very kind of dramatic. I'm, you know, again, thinking about a certain kind of history of painting. I'm thinking about Bronzino. I'm thinking about all these different kind of moments of what it means to capture these young men. So we're going to go to 2001, back in time a little bit, where I was also thinking about the specificity of identity. And I got a residency with the Walker, and these are ice houses that are pulled out for about 2.5-month period of time. And I like the idea of it being a temporary community. And so the notion that this can actually change every year, this kind of neighborhood of your ice houses, and just what it does with the landscape. And I photographed these as well with an 8x10 camera, and the horizon line always stays in the middle, so that it becomes a fractured panorama when all 14 images or 13 images are displayed together. And then I came back to California, to UCLA, and left Yale University, and followed it with another temporary community, which is surfers, and keeping the horizon line the same. And I had this amazing moment where I was able to install the work across from one another in the Guggenheim. And it just became this, you know, like perfect kind of harmony of these moments of people within the landscape. So we're going to jump to 2004, and I know that I'm getting down on time. We have to leave time for questions and Mark, but we'll just go through the next ones and then we'll kind of open it up. So this is self-portrait nursing in 2004 with my son Oliver. And then in 2013, my grandson Joaquin was born. And so that is a portrait of him with his dad, Guillermo, as I was making the portraits and ovals on black. It was really important for me to have that moment where people often don't see, you know, a father holding a newborn. And I wanted it specifically because it was my grandson in conversation to self-portrait nursing. And then you have Oliver in a tutu. This is my son, who's now at Tulane University, his freshman year. And this is from the body of work, and this was taken in 2004 in and around home. And then we're going to go on to the last bit of images that we'll just go ahead and go through. So I've been making political images and landscapes of events for quite some time. This is from the Martin Luther King Parade in Los Angeles in 2005. And then we have the Immigration March from 2006. And we have the Women's March from 2017. And then that brings us to the moment of the last images that I'll show you are from another RV trip in which I did buy an RV during COVID. And I did it to not only drop my son off at college, but at Tulane in New Orleans, but I also did it to bear witness throughout the South right now in relationship to monuments. And so this is the Robert E. Lee Monument that has become an utterly amazing activist site. The Mellon Foundation, it was announced today that they're going to be giving $250 million to revisit and rethink monuments and what they mean culturally. So I kind of just followed the Southern law poverty map of Confederate monuments. And my wife and I went and just made these images because I felt like journalism has been highly influential to me during COVID, but I kind of needed to go and bear witness myself a bit. And so the next images are just from that, and then we'll open it up where Mark and I can have a conversation. Thank you.
So, Kathy, God, it was such a rich depiction of this country, and it was stunning to hear you present.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
So I'm not sure where to jump in, but high on my list has to be the kind of notion of personal freedom and the way it's embodied in the road. Mm-hmm. And I know you've done these 3 road trips spanning different periods in your life and different bodies of work. How is the country, in your estimation, different, or how do you think you view the country differently at these different moments?
I mean, it's a complicated question because the country is always transforming in relationship to our politics, but it doesn't, I mean, ideologically, our country is still based within a huge history in terms of systemic racism. And, trying to grapple with those issues in relationship to bearing witness and what community means and how large this country is. I was always surprised when I did a road trip in Europe, how quickly all of a sudden I could enter a different language in a different, it would be just a completely kind of different place in a certain way within just a couple hours. And so I think one of the hard things about this country is its actual vastness in terms of all the different identities that are grappling with their own histories in relationship to representations. And, I find that, people in the landscape are a really great way to try to unpack some of that. But right now, the country, it's a hard place. It's a really hard place to be in right now.
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of engagement, and I think back to the way sociologists practice, and this idea of participant observer, that you have to be conscious of the impact that you have on the world around you as you're trying to document. And you had mentioned your own community or communities plural and making them visible. How do you think about communicating to a specific audience that may be familiar with certain signs and symbols, and a kind of more didactic model of, explaining communities not ordinarily seen to broader publics?
I mean, that's a really good question because I'm not a photojournalist. I am loosely related to a field of thought around documentary practices. Mm-hmm. I'm not a trained anthropologist. And so a lot of my work is actually questions that I'm grappling with in relationship to the time that I'm living in. And I think that audience, I propose these various bodies of work in relationship to knowing that I'm a very fortunate artist that gets to have exhibitions, and that you know, some people are going to find themselves within the work. And there are other times where people might have a harder time digesting the work, but that the work just exists with this, this rhythm of my looking at the time that I'm living in and trying to make sense of it through various bodies of work.
Yeah. No, it is interesting because you are clearly part of the scene that you're documenting. I mean, you're the care for the individual football players, for them to be relaxed enough around you to let you take their picture, has a kind of tenderness and really celebrates that kind of cusp moment. And clearly the autobiographical work is very significant, literally with you nursing, or in the famous series, The Pervert, where you have incised kind of figures of traditional house, traditional parents. So how do you position the body in your work? Because every time you talked about body of work, I kept thinking the body is
About the
so
body, yeah.
central. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, artists call them bodies of work, and I think that I've been, you know, trained from a certain position in terms of, you know, like it was like very daring to mix everything together. I'm trying to think about mixing it all together now, but it's still like I think of things very succinctly within their time period. But bodies for me, even if it's architecture, is about society and the kind of structure within it in relationship to understanding a greater idea of empathy and humanity. That by looking at even the structure of Wall Street, that at the time 9/11 hadn't happened, but because that happened literally 3 weeks after I finished that body of work, it informed history, then informed that. And that's what happens all the time within photography. You know, it's like we can talk about the FSA project in terms of the Depression and Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange, and we can begin to look at the migrant mother, one of the most iconic images of the Depression. And does that necessarily really inform us about the Depression? Not so much. It's a shared moment between, you know, Dorothea Lange, which is now a very highly debated shared moment in terms of a photographer's control. And so that's the other thing in being careful, is the ethics of photography. You know, and I had to really think about what it meant for me, you know, a white woman, to go out and photograph, even though I've been part of the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of protesting and demonstrating here. But I also, like, who am I to go out and bear witness right now? And that was a question I had to really grapple with. And I just decided, well, this is what you've always done, Kathy. Like, you've always like tried to answer these questions in your mind. So just go and see what happens and see if you can make a body of work. And I think that a lot of time artists shut themselves down, you know, or question that. And I feel like I'm a very ethical person. And so I kind of have to trust my own mind in terms of what I'm doing around representation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is important thinking about the power of the photographer to sort of capture or epitomize a certain type or a certain group. And sort of impressively, you've used yourself and put yourself in front of the lens, so it sort of buys your way in. And
well, that was important. Yeah.
Do this, you know, that you're willing to put yourself under the magnifying glass. Let me just ask you one more question before we open this up. You know, in looking at this most recent body of work about monuments, looking at the work about Elizabeth Taylor, looking at the queer community, these all have iconic images and interpretations. And how do you think about sort of peeling back the veneer or getting underneath the kind of standard meanings of things that we are so familiar with, like highway flyovers, that we don't look at them really as kind of amazing sculptural forms that represent a certain optimism about America. So is this something that you're consciously engaged with, revealing?
I think that's such a great question because it actually is. Like, I'm actually interested in what is iconic, but also debunking what is iconic. So what's iconic in sports photography is the action, right? It's never from the landscape. So you have to realize I'm on these high school football fields with all these high school photographers with big 300mm lens. And I'm holding like a 50 megapixel digital camera with a short little lens. And they're like, what are you photographing? And I'm like, the landscape. And they're like, you know, so the idea that of how we look at things or how things are so pervasively shown within our culture. It's like surfers are always shown surfing. Like there's always these other kinds of ideas of how things are represented. And I'm more interested in the pause and the quietness and slowing it a bit down where a portrait can really all of a sudden give you this kind of energy, but then an abstract landscape of a national park will like bring in a different kind of conversation with how we cognitively begin to disseminate information, especially images, and what our thoughts are of images because we're so inundated with them. Yeah. I mean, we're never not inundated with images, especially now. We all carry a camera in our pocket now.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's both democratizing, but also makes us question snapshots, art, what's the difference, and what is vernacular imagery and what is imagery with another set of intentions. And these are a great set of intentions that you so there are lots of questions.
Good.
So why don't we turn this over to those wonderful people behind the scenes who are helping to read these. So Mark, are you going to read through? And
question one, I'm curious about your choice of black and white for your Freeway and Cities series, especially in light of your other often very colorful works. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, I will. I have this theory about color and about how to look at the totality of imagery. And I'm very interested in ideas of democracy. So I always felt by photographing the American cities and these places in black and white, that it would be a more democratic way to look at the overall image because of their tonal value of black and white, but it also digs deep into the history of photography before the invention of color. So those conversations I'm always like dabbling within the work. But as soon as there's a red sign in a window of a mini mall, your eye is going to go to the red sign. But if you read the whole thing within its gray tone scales, then you're taking all the information in a very different way that feels democratic to me.
Interesting.
Okay. The next question is, I'm interested in the appearance of tattoos on many of your subjects, as well as the marking/wounds on your own body in your self-portrait piece. Could you speak about the role of body markings in your work, and how are the images in your self-portrait cutting series created? Was a tattoo machine used for that?
No, they're all cuttings done with a scalpel. They're all done, the self-portrait cutting on my back with the 2 stick figure girls was done by a friend, a fellow LA artist who wasn't part of the leather community doing that. So she practiced for a while on a chicken breast to make sure her depth of cutting wasn't going to be too intense. And you have to realize what the story of blood was in the 90s and what blood meant, especially within my own community. And to use my own body in relationship to the queer body with the substance of blood and what that implies even in relationship to the history of the body in religious imagery. And all of that was something that I was very, very interested in using that substance for that, the markings on my body in that way. So the other cutting, Pervert, was done by one of the best body workers in San Francisco at the time, Raylan Galena, two people from a shop in San Francisco, and that image is 94, from a piercing studio, Joe and Melissa, who are both in the portrait series, did the needles. And that one was actually in a studio in San Francisco where probably about 12, 13 people came as well to watch that image being made. And that was made more in relationship to my own community, deciding that the leather community were abnormal. And so from my own community, all of a sudden, I was being called a pervert. And I became very aware of how language was used in relationship to our community as we were fighting for rights and the decimation of what AIDS had done to our community. So I just decided to go all out with that one. Yeah, as they say. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
There are two questions related to Rome. Can you share with us a bit about what you're looking forward to doing in Rome, and what are your curiosities about the Vatican? Having not been there before, what are you seeking to see?
Yeah, what I'm seeking to see is, like, in the same way that I went to Lexington in Kentucky to look at the Breonna Taylor Memorial and to see that as a site. What people don't understand about sites that are iconic, or even somebody like Elizabeth Taylor, you wouldn't know what was on her bedside table, right? You wouldn't know that that was her bedside table necessarily. So I'm really interested in our preconceptions of what is iconic, a little bit about what Mark was asking. And I'm fascinated by Vatican City being a city, within a history of ideas in terms of Catholicism and the Catholic Church. But the physicality of it, you know, we all know the treasures that it holds, but what does it, like, what does it look like in terms of its physicality placed within the middle of a city? So in the same way that the surfers are a temporary community, I also think of Vatican City as this temporal, iconic place that I want to try to figure out if there's a way to convey that photographically that goes beyond, you know, this kind of information that is given to us about the place. So I'm gonna just, you know, you go in with these ideas and then you experience it, and then you just try to make work to figure out again those questions that you have in your own mind about it.
Another one came in regarding the Ice House series. It's interesting that you chose to photograph them as verticals, which is not what one would expect in the landscape. Can you elaborate on that choice?
Yeah, I think that what happened was I was out there, and, you know, with anything, you have an idea of what you want to make. And so I knew that so much of the American Cities body of work was about the specificity of identity of place. And so ice houses and skyways were the two aspects in that I brought together. And I first went out on sunny, clear days, freezing cold. You know, I rented a car, drove it onto the ice, and started photographing with the 810 camera. And I took the images home, and I kind of didn't like them. They weren't doing enough for me. So one day I was out there and it was a blizzard. I was like, oh, a blizzard. I hope I don't get stuck. I got stuck, by the way. For a whole moment from Fargo. It's a funny story, but I won't tell you. So when we're in person, I'll tell you sometime the story. But, and then I put the camera to be a vertical and put the horizon line in the middle. And with the blizzard increasing as I was shooting, like, things began to disappear. And so for literally 2 months, I would get on a plane every Thursday after teaching at Yale and fly to Minnesota, being the only one on the plane hoping for a blizzard. because I also really love Ryman, and I was thinking about abstraction and painting and white on white and what that space is. And then because I had done so many things panoramically, by keeping the consistency of the horizon line in the middle, all of a sudden it became fractured with the way that I was hanging them in the studio. And it just did this thing to me on an aesthetic level that made it a very different way to think about landscape. And it was something that I kind of can't stop with. Obviously, I mean, I've made lots of horizon bodies of work at this point now, probably about 5 or 6 of them.
So,
oh, go ahead.
Mark, do we have time for one more?
Yes.
Great.
Can you speak about your role as insider outsider in the communities that you're photographing? For instance, Robert Frank was an outsider in America. Mapplethorpe was an insider with the queer community. Does the role matter in the final product? Does it affect the shoot, how you approach the shoot itself?
It's a really good question. I've never been asked that question. I'm trying to think of an answer. I'll pause for a moment. I think it does matter in terms of ideas around representation. But I think within that mattering about how you proceed to photograph something, you have to understand that humanity is the most important thing of all. And so being an insider or outsider, the first thing is that I'm a human being that is empathetic, who actually like really cares about what's happening in our world on all different kinds of levels. And so I think in that way, the insider outsider isn't as important as who you are as a human being entering a situation that might not be your own community, but what are you trying to portray and say within those various communities? And I think that's really important for every artist to ask. I had a student who had never seen homeless people before, because he came from an area in China where he had never seen any homeless people. So he ends up at UCLA, and he's going around and he's taking photographs of homeless encampments. And we had to have a whole conversation about like, well, why are these important to you? And he goes, because I've never seen this before. And I'm like, but what is this doing for this person that you're photographing? You know, and those are all questions that I have to grapple with all the time within my own work. But by posing those questions and understanding the kind of ethics and trying to have a certain value system that is that you hold, I guess, is stuff that I just try to wrap around with in terms of that inside-outside approach. Because if we're all just like only within our own pods, then do we ever also get to understand that humanity needs to embrace all of us instead of like, no, I'm only supporting this and believe in this. So I tend to try to be more optimistic within what I'm portraying when I go out and decide to do images and bodies of work, so to speak. I hope that was okay. It's a hard question to answer.
Let me see if I can unmute.
Very well.
Thank you so much, Kathy. You know, your curiosity about America in its fullest reminds me of Emerson. It's this kind of embracing of all different qualities and all sections of society, and it's very optimistic work about what we can achieve in actually trying to grapple with things that might not be familiar or customary for us. So thank you for this, and thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's somewhat less stunning hearing one hand clap. So I'd like to, just before we say goodnight, remind you of upcoming programs. On November 2nd, we have the Pergamon Panorama in Berlin, where tradition and innovation converge, which will be Andreas Scholl with Lynn Lancaster, who's our Mellon professor. And then later on in November 16th, we're very pleased to have a conversation between the film critic A.O. Scott and the filmmaker Garrett Bradley. So please join us for both of those. It is wonderful to see you all, and keep coming. And again, Kathy, thank you so much. Good night, everyone.